This is a very different thing.
Mini state.
You can't deploy them to.
You got to make your speech.
Is it a debate with you, or am I answering questions with the host? Because every time I come on, you want to sidetrack and take me into your talking points.
But by all means,
no.
Have at it, my friend. You're the expert. Have at it.
No, I'm no expert. I'm just a concerned American.
You act like one. Have we or have we not?
Have you served in uniform?
I have served as a United States citizen and have read the newspaper.
But I think in this case, I might have a bit of experience that you don't.
Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. Thrilled to have my good friend Paul Rieckhoff on. He's a social entrepreneur, writer, founder, and former president of Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, and our go-to vet for CNN spots. I know it makes you feel dirty, Paul. You've said that, but we're lucky to have you fighting the good fight in the trenches on CNN and everywhere else. We got a lot to cover, man, but let me kick it to you. The list is long. You want to start with VA cuts or the insane nominations or NatSec generally? Over to you.
Well, first off, CNN is a whole different kind of battlefield, right? And I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And I do feel a bit stupid every time I come out of there. I've been pushing for a long time to get more vets on air. I never thought it would have the long-term impact of having one of them become a Secretary of Defense nominee. But we're living in some weird times, man. There's a lot going on. Army Navy is this weekend. I'm repping for Army. We got an 11-1 Army team. I think they should be in the tournament, but they're not. Their quarterback, Bryson Daly, should be a Heisman candidate. He's been denied, but this kid's incredible. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something because it hit me yesterday. The IAVA leadership community is pretty devastated this week because we lost another really great leader to suicide. Zach McElwain, Army vet, was living outside of Indianapolis and was an incredible advocate for us, especially on the backlog issue. He went to the White House, was all over the media, testified before Congress, and he was a real champion for all of us. And we lost him this week. And I want to start there because I think sometimes in the midst of all the politics, we forget about the people. And you and I are really close to the community, and we know this can be a hard time. And all this stuff can be kind of cumulative, whether it's Ukraine, the politics, the isolation, the economy, just the tension in this country. And we got a lot of people who've been stepping up for over 20 years, and it's taken a toll. So I really want to start by saying, especially given the holidays, reach out to your buddies, pick up the phone. The only good thing that happens when we lose somebody like this is it brings us all together. So we're doing a Zoom today and we're all reconnecting and calling each other. And I just would, whether you're a vet or not, especially this time of year and especially with all this political chaos, reach out and just check on people because you don't know how much it might mean and if it might mean the difference. We're all in this together and we got to stick together, especially in the hard months to come. I'm so glad you raised that, Paul, because I had these feelings after the election, this sense of betrayal. And I know that's not what happened. The election of Donald Trump, and people know me, I'm a kind of a hardcore partisan. We're in different lanes in that respect, but America made its decision and it wasn't a rejection of veterans. And a lot of veterans voted for Trump, right? There are different ways to read the outcome. And the worst thing you can do is read it as a total betrayal of American values, the values we fought for. The message is very different. In some cases, it's really subtle and we have to listen, but that doesn't mean we stop fighting back. I describe myself now as part of the resistance. I didn't used to, but that is a badge of pride now. And it's not something that should lead us to depression. Yeah. Well, a good friend of mine, Dave Chasteen, Army vet, chem officer, was also a pastor of some kind at some point. And he said to me once that if America were a religion, veterans would be the clergy. And I think that, in this time of division and strife and, all the threats that are facing our democracy and facing democracies abroad, we have to hold the line for American values. And it's not just Democrats. I think that's a really important takeaway from this election that I hope people process. Now I'm also leading a group called Independent Veterans of America. 50% of the country doesn't have a party affiliation. And I think, whether it's the resistance, the opposition, the future, whatever we call it, it's got to come in many forms and not just from the Democrats. And I've been impressed by how many veterans are stepping up. And I'm constantly disappointed by politicians, but voices like, Admiral Jim Stavridis, who's another guy on TV all the time. I think he's a conscience and a voice of reason. I think those kinds of voices are going to be really important because in many ways, I think the most effective resistance to Trump is not going to come from the left. It's going to come from the middle. And that's where most of the country is. And I think over time, more and more people are going to realize, his true intentions and the destruction that he's going to have on our country in many different ways. And I think they're going to understand it's not just Democrats and people on MSNBC whining about it. It's based in fact, and it's based in upholding our values. And I think that's where veterans can also really shine. Ken, you're a great example of this, but our kids need role models right now, and Pete Hegseth ain't going to be a role model, and Donald Trump ain't going to be a role model, and they're going to need people that they can look to in their community, whether you're, a basketball coach or you're volunteering at a school. You're the man, because there's been a lot of bad male role models, right? We need women, of course, but this is a time where manhood is being kind of co-opted, patriotism is being co-opted, the flag's being co-opted, and like the real tough guys and the real good leaders and the real community activists need to step up and show our kids what real leaders look like, people who are selfless and put country and community first and aren't just there to make a buck or hand us over to the Russians,
Let's talk about Pete Hegseth, because there's this idea about Trump that he's invulnerable, that he can steamroll through any opposition. I mean, his Republican caucus in the Senate has rolled over every time he's pushed them. But the Matt Gaetz withdrawal was a pretty good example that's not true, that if we push back hard enough, we can win. And I think the pressure on Pete Hegseth appears to be working as well. I mean, you've been a steady voice of not just reason, but raising the alarm about how dangerous he would be at the helm of the Department of Defense. What are the top three things that this audience needs to know about Pete Hegseth? And you could pick 20, but the list is long and the top three are pretty bad.
I think the number one thing to understand is that Pete Hegseth is kind of the 5-meter target right now. He's the one that people should focus on because he is the most immediate and the most dangerous, with Gaetz out of the way. And even if Gaetz was still there, I would argue that the Pentagon is kind of the most valuable chip on the board because of obviously things like nukes in our military, but also the cultural impact, the size of the people that are managed, almost 3 million people, the size of the budget. It's the biggest chip on the board, right? And I think that's why it needs to be focused on as a part of talking about Pete. But I think the other thing I would tell people is none of this is normal. None of this is acceptable, and none of it's inevitable. And you got to fight for every yard, right? Let's use the football analogy of the military. You got to fight and hold every piece of ground that you can. And I know a lot of folks are feeling rejected. A lot of folks are feeling down, but this is a time when you need to dig in because Trump ain't stopping. He's rolling. He's feeling himself. He's pushing the pace. He's throwing deep balls like the Hegseth nomination. He wants to run up the score. And Democrats especially are probably in their most powerful position right now to flex their muscle and to push back. So I think Pete is really a crossroads moment, not just for this administration, but for our country. And I'll start with maybe the most important thing. Beyond all the politics and beyond everything else, character is supposed to matter.
Yeah.
And I would give you or anyone else what I call the school principal test. How would you feel if Pete Hegseth was nominated to be the school principal for your 16-year-old daughter? With his multiple marriages and all the allegations, just the way he talks about people and things.
Multiple infidelities, not just multiple marriages, cheated on his first wife like 5 times or something like that.
Right. I mean, and I've said this before. I've known Pete for 20 years. We tangled quite a bit. I've tangled with him. I've tangled with John Schultz. I've tangled with pretty much everybody across the spectrum over the last 20 years, but I also know them. And Pete and I, when he was much more moderate in his early days, actually tried to find some common ground around reforming the VA. And we were both, pissing off the Democrats. And we said, hey, let's put an op-ed together for the Wall Street Journal. And we did. We found common ground, tried to unite. But this was before he went way off the deep end. And he's become much more radical, much more political, and I think much more dangerous because what he's trying to do is really wage a culture war on the Pentagon. And I think folks have seen this, but just to put it in perspective, Trump is picking his most effective culture warrior because that's what Pete is. You can say a lot of things about him, but you can't say he's not effective. He knows how to manipulate the media. He knows how to communicate a message. He knows how to be a champion. He looks the part. And that's what Trump wants, right? So he's sending this guy in to be the lead element on the most important piece of the federal government to wage a culture war, to remove any rights for equality for LGBTQ people, and obviously do radical things like reimpose the trans ban, but even more radical things like tell women they're not equal, right? And then this is an important part that I think gets lost because there's all the personal stuff too. But Pete Hegseth is saying women should not be in combat roles, which is more than just about military. That's saying they are not equal Americans, which I think is contrary to the values of our country and is maybe the thing that he should get pushed on the hardest. from all sides, because number one, it's the antithesis of what our country stands for. Number two, that's not the kind of military we have in 2024. That's like 1824, right? All our allies are there. Your friends in Ukraine, everybody in the modern military has already passed this. So for people who supported Kamala Harris and said, we're not going back, Pete Hegseth is literally the person who's going to drag you back. He's going to remove any kind of abortion access and health care for women in the military. He's going to pick them apart and roll them back immediately from the day he hits the ground. And the linchpin right now is a comparatively moderate Republican, Joni Ernst, who is herself a combat vet, is herself a sexual assault survivor. So what I would tell people right now is focus on Joni Ernst, focus on Olympia Snowe, focus on Lisa Murkowski. Whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent like me, you can move those people right now, because they need to hear from Americans that Pete Hegseth is unacceptable for a variety of reasons. But most of all, because this is supposed to be the spot that's insulated from politics. Barack Obama took Bob Gates, a Republican, because he wanted to show how bipartisan he is. Trump is doing the opposite. He's picking the most extreme, most radical, most political, most narrow guy he can, who is also, a Christian nationalist, who's got tattoos associated with white nationalism, whether he says he is or not. It doesn't look very good. You mentioned the infidelity. That's important, I think, because as you know, adultery is illegal in the military, right? You can be tried in the UCMJ under Article 134 if you commit adultery. So there are these ethical lapses, but the policy issues and the radical nature of his nomination is key. So this is a goal line stand. You got to stop Hegseth, or you got to go down fighting. And then after that, he'll probably nominate someone else crazy, and you're going to have to fight again. And you're going to have to fight on Tulsi Gabbard and other radical picks. But get ready for fights, right? And fight however you can. But right now, I would argue that Hegseth is the most important fight on this entire very busy and dangerous landscape.
Are you looking for something simple and delicious to add to your wellness routine? You're not going to believe how delicious Manacora honey is. I actually hide it from the kids. Unfortunately, my son is almost taller than me now, so he can reach the top shelf, but this stuff goes fast in our house. I've never tasted honey like it. It's more like caramel, honestly. It's rich, creamy, and ethically produced by Manacora's master beekeepers in the remote forests of New Zealand. Manacora honey contains powerful nutrients to support immunity and gut health. The bees collect the nectar from the Manuka tea tree in New Zealand. The nectar is packed with bioactives, and the honey that is produced has 3 times more antioxidants and prebiotics than your average honey. A special antibacterial compound called MGO also comes from the nectar of the tea tree. It's a game changer, and all you need is 1 heaped teaspoon each morning to get the most out of the amazing bioactives. Additional usage throughout the day is completely fine, especially if it helps cut out other sweeteners. Manacora honey is honey with superpowers, and it's easier than ever to try it. Head to manacora.com/Ken to get $25 off the starter kit, which comes with an MGO 850 Plus Manuka honey jar, 5 honey travel sticks, a wooden spoon, and a guidebook. Thanks, Manacora, for sponsoring this episode. It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here to let you know that we'd love to hear from you. Your comments, suggestions, thoughts about future topics and guests. Email us at info@thekenharbaughshow.com. And make sure to rate and review us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and back to the show. It almost feels like this is the nomination equivalent of flood the zone with shit. Like, we have so many fights to take on. I don't give Trump enough credit to say this is his version of 4D chess, and he's doing this to, slip stealth candidates through. But folks like Doug Collins don't even get mentioned, because we have to think about national security. We have to think about Gabbard at DNI. We have to think about a Justice Department going after people like you and me with Kash Patel at the helm. How do we focus our resources in an efficient way, given that there are so many fights that we have to take on?
For me, it's always about strategy and prioritization. And one of my mentors, the great Les Gelb, who was the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, used to say strategy is hard and most people can't do it. And I think the real challenge that hasn't been talked about enough, Ken, is that there aren't any strategic leaders communicating priorities to people. We're looking around like, who's it going to be? Is it Barack Obama? Is it Joe Biden? Is it Cory Booker? Is it Tammy Duckworth? Is it someone else, right? And in the absence of that, people are trying to figure out where to focus. And Trump is cannibalizing on that. That is his strategy, to flood the zone and overwhelm the press, overwhelm Congress, overwhelm the public, and kind of normalize it so somebody like Tulsi Gabbard looks normal in comparison to Gates. And what we have to do is, in our own realm, right? If you're a national security person, focus on the national security nominees. If you're a justice expert or an education expert, focus on that, because it's also fucking crazy that he nominated Lee Zeldin, who has no experience on the EPA, to be the head of the EPA, because he said he was in the Army Reserves and knows how to deal with bureaucracy. So that qualifies just about like everybody you and I know to run the EPA. You've got radicals like Linda McMahon to run the Department of Education. So the hard part is staying focused and staying vigilant, but you must, right? Even though it's holiday time and you want to watch, Elf for the third time and you want to spend time with families, while you're doing that, Trump doesn't give a fuck. He's not sitting under the Christmas tree handing out gifts to kids. He's lining up the next nominees and plowing forward his agenda. So this is really, I think, a gut check time for the Democrats. I'm curious to see, and I'm challenging them to see who is going to emerge right now. I think there are people like our friend Wes Moore, who could be uniquely positioned. He's a man of integrity. He's a veteran. He's an excellent communicator. And for a long time, we used to say, I don't know if I ever said this to you, there might be this inevitable matchup for president one day that would be Wes Moore against, we thought it was going to be Eric Greitens. Right? For a long time, it looked like it could be Eric Greitens. Then we thought it could be Ron DeSantis. Right now, it could be J.D. Vance. But there needs to be at least a Democratic multi-sport athlete who can do all the things that somebody like Hegseth does. And I think Wes is probably the best example. I think there are other younger members and other people who have potential, but I use him as an example because you got to follow somebody's lead, but also challenge everybody else. And if you're an independent, especially, I think that's the real white space. There are a lot of people who don't trust either party, especially after this election. And we are trying to find candidates who want to run for local school board. We ran Dan Osborne for U.S. Senate. He's a Navy vet, an independent. He almost knocked off a MAGA Republican, Dub Fisher. He lost by a couple points, but he showed what's possible. And down ticket, we had 4 other victories for mayor, for local races, and we think there's a future there, right? Especially if you're a Democrat and you're like, I hate these independents. We need to understand that independents aren't just spoilers. They can win in places where you can't. Like, for example, Nebraska. So if we're all focused on the same enemy right now and the same priorities, which should be Trump and defending our democracy, we have to be in it together on some levels and figure out who can win. And I think that's a long-winded answer to tell you that you got to figure out where you can win, where you can spend your energy, and focus on those targets and don't let up, because he's hoping that he'll exhaust you, just like Putin is hoping we'll give up and go home and take our ball. That's what Trump's counting on too, and you can't give it to him.
A lot of Americans are about to enter the find out stage of F around and find out.
Yeah.
How do we communicate the stakes? How do we talk about what Trump plans for the country with Project 2025 and with these nominations without being the I told you so crowd? Because nothing is more annoying and grating. And there's that saying, people will forgive you for being wrong. They'll never forgive you for being right. And I fall into this trap all the time. I just want to scream from the rooftops. We told you this was coming and now it's coming. Don't blame us, but we can't do it that way.
I think some of it is frankly taking the Trump out of it and just focusing on, the pilots would say, focus on the target, right? And what's the target? The target right now is ensuring that we have a competent leader, or the most competent leader possible, the most ethical leader possible to head the Department of Defense, right? So let's talk about what disqualifies this person from being secretary. Let's not even talk about Trump. Let's talk about this individual and the person who's supposed to be a man of character and a moral role model for millions of young people in uniform. And let's keep coming back to the principle test, right? If you really, really feel good, you might love Trump, right? You might love all his policies and his promises, and you think he and Dana White and Joe Rogan are going to make you rich. But would you leave your 16-year-old daughter in the room with this guy if he's been drinking? You really feel good about that? So if you wouldn't leave your kid in the room with him, why do you leave your nukes in the room with him, right? And that's where I think you got to get to, because I don't think most people are actually that dedicated to him. I think they see him as a lesser of two evils. I saw this a lot with independents. That's why you saw Harris actually do better with independents, because many independents just want the lesser of two evils and they're not happy with either of their choices. So if you can break it down to basics and use that kind of local school board test to say, hey, would you be okay with Tulsi Gabbard if you didn't know where her alliances were, if she was meeting with war criminals? Are you okay with the principal of your school sitting down with war criminals and apologizing for Putin? And also, by the way, changing jerseys 3 times in one season, right? I mean, she went from being like a Jets fan to a Giants fan to a Bills fan all in one season. And that's not, you wouldn't trust that person as a sports buddy. You definitely shouldn't trust them to head, the National Intelligence Agency. So I think that's really what it comes down to, is not making it hyper-partisan and just kind of presenting the facts like you would. Let me give you the last example. It's the quarterback test, right? It's like, hey, can you not see that Daniel Jones sucks if you're a Giants fan, right? Like, he's not winning games. He's not getting it done. He's not throwing touchdowns. We're not winning. Right. And when you bring it down to that and say anything is better than this guy, then I think, people can be more objective. But they just kind of glaze over when they hear Rachel Maddow or MSNBC or New York Times. But if Ken Harbaugh sits down and says, listen, would you really, like, we're friends, right? We hang out, like our kids go to school together. Would you really be okay with this guy? And if not, uphold those standards, because I think most people have integrity and character, and it just doesn't get challenged that much.
Awesome. Well, thanks. As always, Paul, we need to get you on here more often. Let's talk again soon.
Thank you, man, for all you're doing, especially around Ukraine. Really want to thank you for your leadership there, man. We also started American Veterans for Ukraine. So if anybody's an American veteran who supports Ukraine, check us out. If you're an independent veteran and you're interested in running, or you're an independent, curious Democrat or Republican, come check us out. In my podcast, I want to give everybody a shout to check that out. I had Sebastian Younger on last week, who I know is a friend of yours. We had the great Barbara Starr, the Pentagon reporter, on last week. And this week I got Leo Shane. The only guy who might know Pete Hegseth better than me is reporter Leo Shane, who's covered this space for 20 years. And we're going to talk about him, Doug Collins, and this entire national security and veteran space. So please check it out and support Ken, because all the work he's doing is awesome.
Cool. Send me the links. We'll put them in the show notes.
Will do, man. Thanks so much. Go Army.
Thanks. Go Navy.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Midas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.